Hi. So today I'm going to be talking about Come By, Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market and The Cries of London by Megan A. Norcia. To begin, Norcia presents the context of Goblin Market as in the setting of locality in the streets of London. And though Rossetti puts Goblin Market in the countryside, Norcia finds many connections between Rossetti's setting and Victorian London. This Victorian London is marked with a significant period of rapid industrialization, and in this period of heightened commerce developed the fear of adulteration of food products, which is the degradation of the quality of foodstuffs, and even xenophobia. Norcia references the large numbers of migrant merchants that had their own language and cultural beliefs and traditions. Norcia argues that this xenophobia is what urges Laura to warn Lizzie of dealing with the goblins initially, and it's a principle that she states is based off of Laura's perception that foreign imported goods would cause domestic products and businesses to suffer. And this is also exemplified in the consistent description of the goblins as being comparable to rats and cats. However, despite these claims, it's ultimately Laura who falls to the goblins' offerings. And what Norcia argues out of this is that, and I quote, abstract principles about global commerce are forgotten in the heady exchanges of the local markets. Norcia also notes the word choice of cries as opposed to shout or call for how the goblins offer their foods. And the specific call of come by as an allusion to the Victorian London in which Rossetti wrote the poem. She claims that these calls are extremely similar to the calls of merchants that Rossetti would have heard as she wrote Goblin Market. She determines the significance of this as being in that the poem is not set in an urban setting, in an urban city, but rather in the countryside. And she says that this decision reflects the effects of industrialization as reaching beyond urban developments and affecting rural communities. And a theme that is discussed throughout Norcia's analysis of Goblin Market centers around the methods in which both Laura and Lizzie barter with the goblins. And before I get into that, another component of industrialization that Norcia tackles is the influx of exotic foods that became readily available to locals. And this leads to question why Rossetti chose fruit as the merchandise being sold by the goblins as opposed to other household items such as milk or flowers. And what Norcia gets out of this decision is that fruit conveys luxury with their sweetness and perishability. In this way, the goblins are literally offering a sugar-baited sales pitch to potential customers, which reflect how Laura and Lizzie respectively react. Norcia argues that Laura demonstrates a level of greed in how she uncontrollably gorges herself in the fruit, serving as a cautionary tale warning against overbuying and overindulgence. On the other hand, Lizzie demonstrates self-control and refuses to indulge in the fruits. And this ties into the methods in which both Laura and Lizzie barter with the goblins. Narcia argues that Laura loses control of the transaction and succumbs to the goblins' terms without counter-offering or negotiating. On the other hand, Lizzie, with the knowledge of Laura's downfall and Janie's death, become a wise customer. And Narcia sees this as a commentary on the loss of knowledge about food origins and quality as a result of industrialization. And this leads her to argue the effects of this being adulteration, parallel to the Victorian fear of all important goods being tainted with inferior ingredients or even poison. And this ties very well with the description of the goblin's fruits as being like honey to the throat, but poison in the blood. In short, Narcia is arguing the ramifications of poor bartering and negotiation in a changing socioeconomic climate. And I think that is very compelling in the evidence provided and the method in which it is delivered. This interpretation of goblin market is a commentary on the economy, and I believe is coherent and persuades the audience in with the chronology of logic. Towards the end of her essay, Narcia incorporates another perspective on goblin market as being children's literature. Rossetti targets this poem to the demographic of children, and Narcia sees this as a juxtaposition of two ideologies in children's literature. On one hand, Goblin Market is a cautionary tale of failing to understand business practices and implementing them. It is seen as a moral story intended to teach a lesson. On the other hand, Goblin Market is highly imaginative with its fantastical elements involving goblins in a fictitious setting. And in this way, Narcia sees Goblin Market as a demonstration of the Victorian state of influx regarding instruction and entertainment. And Narcia also draws comparison to other children's works from the time, including Laura Valentine's and Lucia's London Alphabet, that question the moral character of vendors and merchants, which were used to offer teachable moments about dealing with growing industrialization. This goes to show the instructional tone that was put on much of 19th century children's literature. I think that this is a very interesting perspective in which we see this poem not from the eyes of adults, like how we do with most literary poems, but how it will affect children. By considering the targeted demographic, it's changed my interpretation and understanding of the poem from the eyes of childish innocence. On a broader note, we can use the tactics used by Narcia in her interpretation of Goblin Market to other literature and even global society. More specifically, of the methods Narcia uses is the extensive background and history she gathered from primary and secondary sources of Rossetti as she wrote Goblin Market. What's integral about this is in the use of context in both time and setting in analyzing the variables which that affect the author in writing the piece and ultimately accurately determining author's purpose. Along the lines of this is Narcia's approach of considering the socioeconomic climate at the time. And in the case of Goblin Market, we see that the socioeconomic condition of the Victorian era was characterized with rapid industrialization, which led to increased foreign trade and commerce. And by taking these into consideration, we not only better evaluate literature, but also world issues as they pertain to the effects they have on the people. Overall, I would give this paper an A because it provides a very interesting and nuanced interpretation of goblin market. It utilizes a significant amount of context and period sources that really help it persuade on Norcia's argument. Her analysis of the poem's practicality as a moral story and as a fantasy directed to children was very insightful, and her methods of providing evidence of her claims in a logically sound manner helped as well. My main criticism is just the amount of reliance she had for other works, such as Laura Valentine's and Lucia's London Alphabet, which occasionally was somewhat distant from the essay's discussion. But all in all, I think this was a solid essay that argued that goblin market is a warning to poor financial decisions and decisions in general. So I'll just move on to the discussion questions. I'll read them through. Do you agree with Norcia's arguments? Why or why not? What are the similarities and differences between the actions of Laura and Lizzie compared with Adam and Eve in the presence of temptation? Why did Rossetti choose various fruits as opposed to other merchandise to be sold by the goblins?
Hello everybody, welcome to AP Lit today. Like, some of the things, especially
it's better, yeah. This is a much we try, and a lot of this show is global from the colonies. It's
100 years prior, because it's a lot easier. So I kind of want to take on a few of the questions.
Distant from the essay's discussion. But all in all, I think this was a solid essay that argued that goblin market is a warning to poor financial decisions and decisions in general. So I'll just move on to the discussion questions. I'll read them through. Do you agree with Norcia's arguments? Why or why not? What are the similarities and differences between the actions of Laura and Lizzie compared with Adam and Eve in the presence of temptation? Why did Rossetti choose various fruits as opposed to other merchandise to be sold by the goblins? Is Goblin Market effective as a moral story directed towards children? Why or why not? The Industrial Revolution during the Victorian era resulted in significant changes in society and in the economy. How is that change represented in Goblin Market, and what are the implications of it? And finally, how does our interpretation of Goblin Market from an adult's perspective differ from that of a child's? that's the end of my presentation. Sean, go ahead.
So I guess I kind of want to take on a few of the questions here, rather sort of combine them. I don't know what you'd call it, but I think to really preface my response, I think that it's important when we're looking at historical texts that do fall in these sort of transitional times, such as the Victorian era, especially in the midst of the Victorian era in the 1860s, when you have a lot of the inventions such as railroads and steam engines really coming to a head, that you kind of, like, it's not necessarily an explicit effect. Like, it's not like, oh, we're living in a transitional time with the Industrial Revolution. It's more like, well, I'm living in a time of great change. I don't know what the future is going to hold, and so I'm kind of shy about what could happen next. So I think that that's important in really looking at number 5. Now, I think that fruits are important because fruits have always been rather symbolic as a sort of item of power, of luxury, and of I guess purity. Because fruits, very sweet, they're not necessarily nutritional, at least compared to vegetables, but they taste sweet, and generally, if you don't eat them relatively quickly, then they're going to spoil. So they kind of have that sense of purity, because if you don't take advantage of them, then you're going to have moldy apples, and moldy apples aren't necessarily good to eat. So there's that element, and so I think that you could almost pair this. You could dice this fruit a few ways. You could say that with the fruits being sold by the goblins, in the Industrial Revolution, you do have a lot of these luxury goods being sold for a much cheaper price than you would, let's say, 100 years prior, because it's a lot easier to make nice clothes, for example, with a loom, with a steam loom, rather than having to spend a week knitting together something. So I think that's one way to slice it. And another way to slice it is that you have these pure fruits sort of being defiled, and it could also be taken then from a sort of what's it called when someone's really like anti-technology? Luddite, that's it, Luddite. So I think that that's one to take it. Now, is Goblin Market effective as a moral story directed towards children? I'd say it is, simply because it does have a lot of the elements that sort of check off the box for a children's story. As Dr. Dawkins was saying, it does have the fruits and that sort of children's story imagery. Now, of course, if you really read between the lines, then maybe it's not as much of a children's story as initially thoughtful as you might initially think. But I don't think children necessarily do read between the lines as much as we do. And I mean, when you compare a story like this to, let's say, the Germanic fairy tales, then I'd say this pales in comparison, because in those you have you have kids being led off into the woods by a Pied Piper, never to be seen again, and people getting regularly killed, eaten, and a whole bunch of very unpleasant things.
Right. So the Victorian period, as you said, Sean, is a period of change, right? So you're going from a local market to a more broader foreign commerce, or more foreign people coming, migrants coming in. They're more imported goods. It's a period of change, and I think it's also deviating from traditional, as you mentioned, Germanic children literature, in which it incorporates new aspects of the situation that they are in the Victorian period. David, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. I'm honestly ask your questions too. Do I agree with the argument? Yeah, I guess. I'm personally a bit, yeah. Sean, of course, is modifying that remark, so it's better. Yeah, it still has much to be trade, and a lot of it is trade is global from the colonies. Yeah, but we're getting to an era of globalization. So, like say, not yet. Yeah, industrialization pervaded everybody. It's funny that we don't see any industrialization in Wuthering Heights, because even though Bronte wrote it in like mid 1800s, it was set like at the turn of the century, right? So that's the interesting thing. Also helps my analysis. Yay! But anyway, yeah. So the Industrial Revolution changed a lot of things in society and economy. And you had this kind of thing, and I don't know. I think I'll get to that later if I can say something a bit more coherent than what I just said. If not, I'll skip it. I think there are similarities between the actions of Laura and Lizzie compared with Adam and Eve. I mean, obviously they're not the same, you know. They're just not because Adam and Eve. Plus, it's not like they're losing humanity and at the end everything's fine because it's a children's story, unlike Paradise Lost, which I don't think is a children's story. Correct me if I'm wrong. But there are similarities. You've got one who gives in to temptation, even though she's like, "Oh no, don't go there. Oh no." You've almost got an Eve-like attitude in Laura, and Lizzie is not Adam, but she shows a bit more restraint, and seems sort of to be acting as a figure who wants to. Yeah, she almost immediately changed her mind. Reminds me a bit of Eve. And Lizzie reminds me a bit, it's pretty different, though, of Adam. Just in sort of a slightly superior character, and what I mean by that is, like, restraint, control. And then going because she's wondering what the heck is happening to her sister. that does seem a little bit like Adam. So isn't it an effective moral story? I suppose. Not every story has to end with eaten by grandmother, chopped off head, that kind of thing. Doesn't have to. Because this teaches you a lesson. They're fine, and you will be too little child, but wouldn't it be better if you hadn't done that? So in that sense, I think it is effective enough. And it's not quite as scary as some of the German fairy tales. I don't know. We did a little Riding Hood last year in different variations of it in MWA. It's a bit disconcerting, perhaps. Some of the interpretations was a bit disconcerting. My last remark. I think it might be my last remark. Actually, this is a short one. How does our interpretation of Goblin Market from an adult's perspective differ from that of a child? I think Dr. Dawkins would give us an excellent perspective on that, but I'm not an adult. We're not adults, so I have no idea. Okay, that's enough. Industrial Revolution. Sean covered it better.
Okay, I guess we'll sort of look at question 5. It seems that there are multiple possible interpretations of the poem. Not only that it's sort of a critique of foreign influences with the Goblin Market, but like some of the things, especially when Lizzie goes into the sort of withdrawal from the fruit, almost seems like it relates to drug use, and there are other places in the poem where it seems not to be, explicitly about about foreign influences, but I guess thinking about that state of withdrawal as maybe what Rossetti is trying to say is the possible change that will result from the Industrial Revolution and the influx of people from other countries bringing goods. It's sort of interesting because if the change, looking at question 5 there, is represented in that state of withdrawal. To recover, she also requires the fruit again, and in that way, it seems like it's almost sort of a flawed analogy, because the fruit is both what brings her into this state of illness and brings her closest to death, but it also brings her back from that, and it teaches her some important lessons. Right. She doesn't eat it directly again the second time, but it's also what brings her back. So I'm not sure what else in the poem could represent the change in society and the economy, especially because she comes back from it. But that might be something interesting to look at as a representation of that change in the poem.
Yeah, so going off of that, maybe even the Lizzie's rejection of eating the fruit could be a rejection of change in the Industrial Revolution. And looking from the context of Rossetti as an individual, she was a member of, I don't remember exactly what it was called, but an organization that believed that art was taking a downward turn after Raphael in the Italian Renaissance. So I think that's an interesting thing to consider.
Okay, sorry, I'm just gonna assume that it's my turn next. First of all, good presentation, Milton. I really enjoyed that. So I guess what I wanted to talk about was just briefly like the sixth question. I don't know, just because I was reading through it, and I guess at first I didn't really consider like the Victorian era. So I don't know if I fall under like the child's perspective, just because normally or at least when I think of like a child's perspective, like on just anything, I guess, or anything that requires interpretation, I always see it as more like straight to the point, very like or maybe more like objective. I know I read somewhere something about how like children's interpretations of things do differ from adults, in the sense that adults tend to not necessarily overthink it, but they make it very, very, they make it very subjective. Sorry, I'm reading the terms mixed up. At least our present day definition of subjective, and children are more objective. They're just very straight to the point. But adults tend to overthink things, and they make it kind of difficult. And I'm not saying right now that this is our our interpretation of the Gotham's market is overthinking it or anything. But at least for me, it would have been very difficult for me just on my own if I were just sitting in a gray empty room, and I just was given this poem. I don't think I would have been able to guess or connect the dots that this would be like talking about like the Victorian era. And so that's just kind of like where I see an interesting change in mindset. Just because if I read it, I think this is like a children's story about don't go eating fruit, or like I don't know. I guess just something along those lines, just very like based off of the story. And I guess at the same time, this might also be based off of maybe not mindset, but the way you think. Yeah, but that's just kind of how I saw it.
So I kind of wanted to take this on a little bit of a different direction and talk about an adult perspective, a child's perspective, and morality of the story. I think temptation can mean different things depending on what the demographic is. Aimed at kids, Goblin Market is kind of almost manipulative way of creating ideals and connection for young children on like a very stranger danger kind of fairy tale. It can also be a way of widening kind of divide. It's like fear of different classes, like the lowest class merchants, or kind of the appeal of like foreign food. Huge, gigantic consequences of physical danger and illness that come as a result of interacting with people of different races and classes. On the other hand, if it's being aimed at adults, I guess really looking at moms, you can see it as like a really dark story, kind of about these ideals of maidenhood, which is a word that's used a whole lot in the film Temptation, but it's definitely still a moral story. I think that Temptation is drugs, especially with Jeannie, who is used as like a precautionary tale because I think she dies. It's like once you eat the goblin food, fear of the goblins fall anymore. And it's like something's been lost, like spoiled or almost ruined, or you die, which I guess is the ultimate loss. But there is just a whole lot going on.
First of all, great presentation. I found this poem really cool. I wanted to talk a little bit about that last question about children's and adults' kind of interpretations of this poem. Maybe less coming from whether I am necessarily a child or an adult, but from maybe like a younger child. I think knowledge and preconceived notions of like what we should trust, what we should not trust, are probably a lot stronger in adults than children, and I think this poem kind of plays to that a lot. Certainly, when Dr. Dawkins kind of talked about the ice cream truck, it made me think of that example of the white van with the man leaning out the door saying, "Come in for free candy" or something like that. An adult would immediately I would assume that an adult would not trust that situation based on what they've heard, what experiences they have of people manipulating other people. But children are looking at the candy and the gain, and wow, this is different. This is interesting. I might get something sweet and rewarding out of this. I should go check it out. This is exciting. That kind of thing. So I think that would be kind of a child looking at this, being like, "Oh, fruit! It looks amazing. They're describing it as being really tasty. I should go after that. The goblins look interesting. I've never seen anything like this before." Whereas an adult would, I think, especially the descriptions kind of lend to an adult, even with them being goblins, there's an immediate distrust of the situation. Something's going to go wrong, etc. And I think the differences in Laura's and Lizzie's descriptions of the goblins as they're going up to buy the fruit kind of play into that, because Laura seems more of the trusting child in the situation, and Lizzie, when she describes the goblins, it's much less favorable toward them, and displays a lot more of that inherent distrust in her being a little bit more mature, a little bit more intelligent, and more knowing of the world, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess going off of that, maybe we should also consider why Rossetti decided to portray the tempter as a goblin instead of a creature that is more appealing and a more likable in a sense. And especially if we were to look at this from the perspective of a child, and when I say child, I mean like a younger child, in his or her toddler's age, and that from a child's perspective, this would be taken more literally, right? So, I guess in a sense, by portraying the tempter as a goblin, does that suggest that? I guess what I'm trying to say is whether portraying portraying the Tempter as a goblin affects how we, as in a more analytical sense, interpret the meaning of goblin market compared with that of how a child who would consider it more literally take it.
So I kind of wanted to jump back a little bit to the Adam and Eve question a bit, because I feel like one of the differences too is like how the temptation is presented to each character, like Adam and Eve and Laura and Lizzie. So like I feel like in the beginning of Goblin Market, like it's very much a, you know, they're selling their wares and they're like describing them in this really you know, positive way and trying to like, you know, influence somebody into buying them or tasting them. And then in Paradise Lost, like at first, you know, the fruit is just kind of forbidden. So it's like this, you know, the what you can't have, so you want it more sort of idea. Like the fruit from the goblins like almost isn't explicitly like forbidden from them. Like there isn't anyone else. Like Dr. Dawkins just said in the poem, like keeping them away from it. It's really just their own like devices, which is I think a really interesting distinction between her comparison of Adam and Eve. And then I do think that Laura, she is very similar to Eve in the sense that, you know, we have like Satan come to Eve and, you know, describes this wonderful thing that's going to happen if you eat this fruit, and it's like very similar in the sense of, you know, like the goblins like describing their wares sort of thing. But then Lizzie is so different than Adam, because she does hear the wares in the same way that Laura does. Like they have the same experience, and she just blocks her ears and like walks away from it and like will not be tempted by it, and then like goes back and saves her, like risks her life. Like Adam just kind of like just kind of like follows Eve. Like he doesn't like try to like save Eve. He doesn't like try to do anything to like protect her. He doesn't bring her back. So it's like, I think what's really interesting here is that it's almost like Laura, she in a sense returns from the fall. It's like this reversal. Right, so like in Paradise Lost there isn't a return, and you can't, but there doesn't even seem to be an option, and we don't really know if there's going to be an option here, but they like try it out and it happens to work. So it's like this strange return to innocence, perhaps, which I'm not really sure how that works. Like how could one return to innocence after you've eaten the fruit? Like it doesn't really make sense to me. I don't have an answer for it, but I just thought like it's a very interesting parallel when you're looking at it from the perspective of Paradise Lost.
Hi everyone. So I guess what I'm most interested in here is probably question 4, and more specifically, I think we discussed this a little bit before, but sort of the choice of how Rossetti depicts the goblins. And I think the line that I found most interesting is it's around line 140. Demure grimaces, cat-like and rat-like, reptile and wombat-like, snail-paced in a hurry.
Vikram, can you hear me okay? Do you want to try once more? Maybe you just had a spike. Come on, try again.
Alright, attempt number 2. Let's hope this goes better. Usually I don't have those big problems live. Okay, so hopefully you guys can hear me okay. As I was mentioning, I'm sort of really interested in the goblin side of things. So on page 100.
Humorously, I think you cut out at like the same spot. Like when you start talking about that page, Adobe's like, "No, I don't want to hear about rat tail like goblins." Vikram, do you think you could write your idea in text chat, and we'll go to Rebecca? Go ahead, Rebecca.
Okay, so I'm hoping this is going to work, but yeah, so I kind of wanted to go back a little bit to what Sarah was talking about with Adam and Eve in kind of relation to Laura and Lizzie. And I think it's interesting that we see kind of at the very end of the Gobble Market, Laura and Lizzie are using this as like a cautionary tale towards their own children. And the way that they portray it is that it's kind of like the way that they support each other is what saves them in the end. So kind of like the love between them as sisters is kind of what brought them back to, like Sarah was saying, return to innocence. And what we see with Adam and Eve is that Adam kind of falls out of paradise through his kind of like love for Eve. And I think it's interesting that in one way we have like the relationship between two sisters drawing them together and out of danger. And then with Adam and Eve we have kind of what might be seen as like the love between them is bringing them together, but out of what might be a paradise that potentially Adam might have stayed in if he didn't go with Eve. And I think that we see kind of a similar naivety in Laura and Lizzie confused, but I'm thinking it's Lizzie, but as in Eve, and kind of what Sarah was talking about, that she in this story is really a child, and she does return kind of to innocence, which seems rather strange. She metaphorically, she gets rid of the apple, and she gets better, and it's all okay. And then we see with Adam and Eve, there's a punishment sort of for that poor choice, even though they come from the same place of just not knowing what the right thing to do is. So I think that's interesting. Maybe kind of we see an adult and a child possibly with the same mindset that kind of have different consequences for the outcomes of being tempted. And maybe those two tales are meant to caution, one for a child and one for an adult even. And that's why I don't know if this would work as a moral story, because it's maybe for a child kind of hidden in metaphor so much, and also I don't know that it really teaches a child that, oh, don't eat the fruit. It almost teaches the child, oh, eat the fruit and your sister will save you, so be nice to your sister.
Yeah, I actually wanted to touch on some of the same things that Rebecca did and Sarah did in terms of Adam and Eve. But first, in thinking of Goblin Market as a moral story for children, I think that we pointed out earlier that children, especially younger children, will often take it more literally than it might be intended. And I think that's okay in terms of having an effective moral story, because this concept of black humor in children's literature, I think, is really prevalent. I mean, for example, if anyone was in MWA last year, we read The Adventures of Pinocchio, right? And I would say that's kind of a piece. It's definitely not
Yes, it's very dark. It's very dark. And at the same time, it's still intended to a certain extent, although that is debatable, for children. It has elements that can appeal to children and really, really fit in that idea of children's that genre of children's literature. But at the same time, it's kind of ghastly. It's gruesome. It fits in that macabre genre too, and I think that's kind of similar to Goblin Market because it does, at the end, like Rebecca just pointed out to us, the end of Goblin Market is kind of clearly a moral lesson. It's like, for there is no friend like a sister to strengthen whilst one stands. Like, it's emphasizing the importance of your sister or your sibling or that kind of relationship. But throughout the poem, we do see these elements that are definitely kind of grim, a little bit grotesque, often, I think, especially with the goblins. And so I think those two kind of coupled, that idea, that concept of children's literature or work intended for children, and that kind of nasty part of genre, that death, correlated kind of thing. I think those combine a lot in a lot of more black humor inclined children's work, and I don't necessarily think that takes away its effectiveness as a moral story. And the reason I say that is because when we read Pinocchio last year, I recall that we kind of, being able to analyze literature and make judgments about it, saw the kind of grim, darker aspects in it. But, children, when reading that, may not see it as bad or as terrible as we do. Because even though they might take it literally and think of actual goblins, maybe they might be scared, it's still less likely that they might look at this and say, wow, this is really dark, or think about it like that. And so I think it doesn't really take away from its effectiveness as a moral story for children. And then I think that actually correlates to, we were talking about how nasty some of the the goblins are, how kind of gross it is. And I think that I'm connecting this to the other question about Adam and Eve. I think that it's similar because in general, I think in a lot of cultures, the story of Adam and Eve is actually taught to a lot of young children. I could be wrong, but I know that I've had people and communities near me in which they were kind of taught about that story early. And so we have the serpent as a part of that story. And I mean, I wouldn't say that they're the same, but I would say the serpent is kind of nasty and also grim, and it's also not a really great figure to be like, oh wow, like as a child looking at that, So I think that those similarities are in a lot of stories that are taught to children at an early age. Yeah, and involving a lot of non-human characteristics. And so I think that it's still works as a moral story directed towards children. There's a lot of gruesome aspects of the Adam and Eve, the creation story itself, and so I think the fact that that's taught to children at an early age, maybe in a distilled way, is still interesting to think about in general, in considering children's literature in general and what's taught to children at a young age, despite whatever its content is.
Yeah, and I guess going off of that, as you said, that children take things more literally than intended, maybe perhaps it's intended to be that way, as children would read this when they're younger and then they come back to it later, they can create a new interpretation of the same piece, right? So maybe as children grow older, the story evolves with them to remain applicable to them. And what Norcia is discussing is that this is meant to discuss bartering, right? Not being taken advantage of when dealing with merchants. But as you look more deeply into it and you create a more nuanced interpretation of it, you can see that it's about temptation, and it has a lot more implications than just the literal interpretation of it.
Okay, so I just wanted to answer question 6 about an adult's perspective differing from that of a child's. And for me, at least for the first half of it, what I found was similar. At least I think, I don't know, I'm like 18. I guess I'm an adult, but I think I have like more life experience than like a younger child. For me, there was like I almost thought about it like the way like the fruits, in the goblin markets. For me, there almost seemed to be kind of a parallel, like similar to drugs and like kind of like drug dealers almost, or like at least being like seduced by drugs in a way. And like there was just that kind of dark connotation of Laura, like like in like getting the fruit, and then like all she wanted was more fruit. And for me, that almost seemed kind of like being addicted to a drug. And it like I think that was like almost like a darker connotation that went along with that story. And then similar, like also like the Adam and Eve story, like where it gets a little bit dark, and like something that's not necessarily, a very, positive story. It's a story that shows like human flaws and such. So for me, I think for a child's going to see this probably more literally, it's like maybe even imagine goblins and imagine fruit and think about, fruit, and maybe draw some sort of connotations. They'd probably be a little bit more abstract, and they might not even grasp the fact that, that it's, it's something that's very critical and very dark. But for me, it seems to be something, like from an adult perspective, something that goes a little bit darker almost. At least, like when she like wants like, the fruit, and that's like all she thinks about. Like at least like, how she's like suffering at the beginning. So that was just kind of how I interpreted the beginning, kind of the difference between an adult and a child.
Okay, so I kind of wanted to address something similar to what Sangeetha and Rebecca did. So basically, the way that I'm seeing it is that the goblin market would be sort of effective as a moral story for children, because like as Sangeetha said, children do kind of take things more literally, as we see. Regularly, I guess. So if we see that, if we look at it through their perspective, then we see sisters. They're attacked by goblins, more or less. I'm just streamlining it at this point. They're attacked by goblins. They make it out, but they make it out. They're quote unquote redeemed. Unlike Adam and Eve, I guess. And then they get out of it they're able to survive, I guess, in that sort of sense. So if we look at that, we see a sort of a close call story, and especially with how Vikram said the goblins were portrayed. I have the quote, goblins as quote-unquote little humans, and then they possess traits of wombats and rats, all that stuff. So if we see that as the human thing, and if that sticks in the mind of a child, then we see that, oh, this might happen to us. Again, thinking about it from a children's perspective. So, if we see that, it does teach people to be wary of like all the stuff that we've talked about. So, in that kind of sense, I do see the kind of form of what Rebecca said of it maybe not working out as a moral story, because it does ultimately end with one sister saving the other and all that stuff. Sorry, I get the names confused. But yeah, with that, even though it does provide an out, it's still, with their reflection, demonstrates that there were really negative impacts from that encounter. Oh no, I'm an idiot. Okay. So if Lizzie saves Laura, there is still sort of an out, but it does sort of show lasting repercussions, I guess, as they think about it, and that they warn their children not to do that sort of stuff. So, given that that's how it ends, I think that, yeah, for sure. I think that since that's sort of how it ends, I do think that it's able to be reconciled from not being a specific moral story, or like Rebecca was worried about, into being something about a moral story, like don't talk to people, but like yeah, I think that ultimately I think that it's effective as a moral story for children. Yeah.
Okay, so I've got a couple comments. One of them is kind of on the adult versus child perspective, and I kind of agree with Milton. I think it sort of grows with maybe someone as they grow up. And I think as portraying the goblins as, or the kind of negative force or evil force in the poem as goblins, children might see it as a literal goblin, and having that kind of non-human aspect, they maybe understand it better as evil, whereas maybe if it were a human, or maybe a man, they could be more confused and say, like, wait, my dad's a man, or like, our neighbor's a man, and they're human. So kind of putting it in a child's literal perspective, a goblin is kind of clearly evil, maybe. But then as you grow, as I'm not saying I'm an adult, but as gaining more perspective, goblin maybe becomes to represent not maybe a literal goblin, but something more representative of evil. I also think that's kind of in line with all the different kinds of interpretations that you could have, whether it's with drugs or maybe foreignness, as in maybe the time era. So agreeing there. And I also had, I was interested in the idea of kind of bartering and kind of the economy maybe. So I found it interesting that Laura, I think I got that one right, Laura, who's the one who kind of falls, she trades her hair for the fruit. So her hair, I mean, in the poem, her hair is depicted as kind of gold in itself. It's like they say you have a lot of gold on your head, and it's beautiful, it's valuable, and so. But hair will grow back, whereas when Lizzie goes to try to get the fruit to save her sister, she has a penny, which, as we would consider, would probably be more. It would seem to be more valuable, like actual money, than just like a bit of hair. But so I think that could maybe come to the idea that the cure is more costly than the kind of the fall or the temptation. So that could be maybe a teachable instance. But then also the goblins reject the money. So I guess I'm wondering, what does that say about maybe how different it could be something about maybe how different cultures value different things, or it could be something about how it could go into the idea of kind of maidenhood and how Laura sells part of her body, whereas Lizzie isn't doing so.
I actually found that very interesting, and one aspect I wanted to comment about is how the goblins value hair over the money, and maybe this is even going along the lines of the interpretation of foreign commerce as being sort of taking her identity compared with taking Laura's identity compared with taking Lizzie's money, and how the goblins are robbing, I guess, England of their identity, and with their foreign cultural influences, or just foreign influences in general. Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with all the points. I could see it as a child story, as a children's story. definitely has a lot of good lessons for them, like about temptation and sibling, like sisterhood, or just like friendship. And I like the point that Olga made about like kind of shows kind of like seems like drugs, like drug sellers. Like I kind of see that in the goblins, and like I could see how like like it's similar to people who like stand firm to like not go into that, or just like or like people like Lizzie who like give in and they take it. And Dr. Dawkins brought up the question of why all the humans are girls, and I think that could be because it's relating to like what she's been saying, like about like prostitution and stuff like that. And or it also could be like kind of like the other works we've been reading, kind of for like women's rights and trying to like show the kids, maybe the girls, to like believe in themselves and stuff, especially during this time. And I think that what Norcia did by looking at the time that the story was written to find a meaning is definitely smart. And yeah.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if you wanted to step in there. And I hope that I won't repeat anything. I had a problem with my computer a couple minutes ago. But in terms of thinking about the poem as whether it's directed at children or adults, I think it does exist at multiple levels. If we think about the fruit as a representation of sin, just like in a biblical story, it seems like where the poem is directed at children, the sin within the fruit is greed and gluttony. But for adults, it's perhaps representative of a sort of sexual lust, and where Lizzie is a Christ-like figure, that makes a lot more sense out of the strange, or at first what seems strange, where Laura sucks the fruit juices off of her. That could be perhaps a sort of communion where, eat me, drink me, love me is what Lizzie says. Exactly, Dr. Dawkins. And it seems like in that sense, the poem is quite progressive with respect to the idea of a fallen woman, both in the biblical sense, where you fall from the grace of God, and in the Victorian societal sense, where a woman sort of loses her virginity and value in the community. So it seems like the message is that women are capable of sin in Laura as she falls, but it's not just that they are sinful Eve to fall for this, what it really is a forbidden fruit. They're also capable of redemption, and it is Lizzie who is the God and Christ-like figure. So that is one aspect where the poem offers a more progressive views about women. And in addition to the biblical sense of the fallen woman, the Victorian sense, Laura is redeemed through Lizzie, and even though it's, I guess it is pretty clear what happens to her. She ends up living a happy life, even though at one point in time she falls prey to the temptations of the fruit, and she can pass on her lessons and messages to the next generation.
I'm glad you brought up that passage, Chloe, because that's something I wanted us to talk about. Whenever Lizzie says to Laura, eat me, drink me, suck my juices, it's like a weird way to talk. So I did want to just bring up, I wonder to what extent Norcia's offered this reading about the goblins as being kind of like a fear of the other. And I wonder, to what extent do we always carry that over? Like, if we think about this as kind of a more allegorical meaning having to do with kind of reading it the way that Chloe's reading it there, as a kind of more generalized discussion about women can fall, but that doesn't mean that then they're dead, they're done, they're over. They can also be redeemed, right? That they still have value and they're worth saving, right? And it's worth still, loving them and keeping them in your community as opposed to kind of exiling them. If, like, at that point the goblins, like, thinking about them as foreigners becomes less important, and they kind of just have a symbolic function as just untrustworthy people, as opposed to specifically people from outside of England, right? So, in how much does their goblinness necessarily point them towards, people who are non-English, and in what context and what reading? So, if it's okay with you, Milton, I'd like to switch over to my slides now so we can go to that passage Chloe was talking about. Did you have any remaining kind of follow-ups or final words you wanted to give? All right, let's give Milton a round of applause for a set of questions that really produced a lot of discussion. 100% participation.